Hello friends, for today I wanted to have a companion video to my top 10 fantasy romance books that I have picked up. And as the title would imply for that one, I was highlighting my favorites of the over 75 plus different fantasy romance books I've picked up. I've made very clear that my heart is still more so within fantasy. I wanted to give fantasy romance a fair shot and ensure that I try different ones from the genre, because I think a lot of times when people are diving into a new genre, the tendency is, what are the greats? What are the ones that fans of this genre have stated to be the best of the best? And when that happens, sometimes interestingly, it's not as appealing to us. So for example, I absolutely love fantasy, but there are plenty that are considered staples that I'm not the biggest fan of. For example, Black Prism by Brent Weeks didn't necessarily work out for me, but then other times, for example, Mistborn is consistently hyped up and put on best of lists, and I do really like Mistborn. Sometimes the greats of a genre can be very hit or miss for people. So with fantasy romance, I didn't want to just try the ones that are considered the staples. I wanted to branch out, try some underhyped ones, try ones that are more genre blenders, and then also still try the staples and just kind of see where my interests ended up. And I do find that mine tend to lean a little bit more towards the romantasy category, where it's a blend as opposed to fantasy romance, where it's more of a romance within a fantasy setting. There are exceptions, of course, but those are more so my taste. What I wanted to do today, though, is look at those ones that are considered the staples of the genre, kind of just highlight how sometimes they don't always work for all of us. I'll kick it off with a book that just recently came out this year, and that would be The Night and the Moth. Interestingly, when I picked this one up, I would actually more so consider it within the romantasy category, and also a lot of people really like the world building and the general writing and atmosphere created by this author, which all sound like check, things that would appeal to me. I had tried something else by this author in the past, and it just wasn't quite clicking, but I thought, oh, there's probably a pretty good chance that this one will. It tends to, at the very least from what I've observed of my interest with this genre, it seems like it's going to fit with what I tend to like. However, when I picked it up, I found that the reasons that the other one wasn't quite working for me ended up being why this one didn't work as well. I do appreciate the atmosphere it's created. I don't dislike the writing by any means, but I almost feel like I am not able to ever fully feel like my feet are firmly on the ground, because it has this headiness to it that, while it creates an interesting feeling in you, the reader, I want a little bit clearer some of the world building details. I want to understand the environment. I want to understand the magic on a little bit of a deeper level. Not that I need it to be a hard magic system, but I guess if it's going to lean harder, I want rules and limitations. And if it's not, I tend to lean towards wanting it to feel a little bit more ethereal and magical, to put it bluntly. And this one kind of leans somewhere in the middle, and it just always feels like things are being delivered to you as the story progresses. Not that I need giant info dumps at the beginning. I think a great example of a book that leaves you in the dark for a long time is The Bone Shard Daughter, and I thoroughly enjoyed that one. But at some point in that story, you start to feel really connected to the characters, and you start to feel really with them as they are progressing through the plot. And interestingly, in this one, the more that it progressed, the less interested I became, because I was not really as invested at the beginning, and I wasn't necessarily as intrigued as I wanted to be. The, quote, vibes of the story weren't quite enough for me to have it override my lack of interest in the characters, and I got pulled in on occasion, and then I got kind of pulled out, pulled in, pulled out, and then by the end of the story, I didn't love the ending, and so that kind of solidified it not working as much for me. However, I tend to not look at reviews before I jump into a book, especially with newer releases. It's a prime opportunity to go into something without other people's thoughts impacting you before you even read it. And that's what I did for this one. I read it without looking at other people's thoughts, and then I had my own personal feelings about it. I relayed those, and then once I've done all of that, then I let myself look at reviews. And sometimes when I look at reviews for this one, I know it's a cliche to say this, but it almost feels like people are describing a different book than the one I read. And maybe you feel the same in hearing me talk about this book and what didn't work, and you feel completely opposite. But it is interesting to me that it has established itself as a prominent voice in fantasy romance, because first off, I might even see this more so as fantasy with a heavy romantic subplot over fantasy romance. So I'm already kind of surprised it's risen to almost staple status. But then also, I just don't know that I was that invested in the romance anyway. So it's not really one that's worked for me. Where that one was a newer release, we have one that's a little bit older, and that would be From Blood and Ash. From Blood and Ash definitely fits more into the fantasy romance that's kind of campy and fun, and very much writing on this is a fantasy romance, and the sexual aspects of the story are going to be right at the front of the character's mind, as we have a character who has been isolated because she is meant to be this important figure, and as such, she hasn't really had any opportunities to explore her sexuality, but she wants to, and so part of the story is following her as she is trying to do that. And she ends up having, of course, this very hunky bodyguard, and they have chemistry and banter, and I kind of get why it's a staple within the genre, because it does have a lot of the pieces that people are looking for, but I do tend to prefer, as I've said already a couple times here, and I've said in the past, I prefer the fantasy plotline, or just the plotline in general, to be motivated outside of the romance, but then for romance to come into the picture. So I like that blend. And I also really appreciate when love kind of takes people by surprise in a sense, and then they have to try to grapple with these world-ending stakes, or maybe just stakes. They don't even have to be world-ending, but they're trying to deal with these stakes that are unrelated to the romance. They have to deal with that first and foremost, and trying to find ways to support each other within all of that. To me, that's oftentimes more compelling. The kind of openly lustiness that characters have in books like this one tends to not work as well for me. Not saying it can never work, but in this instance, it didn't really as much. After that, we have a book that forever and always will be not for me, and that would be A Game of Fate. So, if you've read From Blood and Ash and not this one, what I was describing with the lustiness being first and foremost the kind of number one thing motivating you to turn the page. I mean, this one makes From Blood and Ash look like it's clutching its pearls, because this one is following Hades and Persephone, and there is a series that follows Persephone's perspective. This one is following Hades' perspective, and Hades just wants to do it with Persephone so badly. And even if he does, he still just really wants to do it again. That's kind of a lot of what this one is. Not saying there's no plot whatsoever, but a lot of the story, a lot of the words in the story are dedicated to describing either how much he wants to do it with Persephone, or when he's in the process of doing it with Persephone. And that wasn't as much for me, and some of the ways that it's described are kind of funny, too. I've said before that he dumped her out of her pants will forever be one of my favorite lines in anything, but probably not for the right reason. After that, we have When the Moon Hatched. This one seemed like it was absolutely going to work for me, because I'd heard that the world building was so cool, and it seemed like it was really heavy on the lore, and I was very excited about that. This one, unfortunately, while I actually really did like the lore, and I felt like the opening origin story was awesome and creative, I found that the main character was so irritating, unfortunately. And when it started, I was like, okay, she grates a little, but I can deal with a character that grates a little if I feel like later on down the road they grow, or I actually feel like maybe I start to be endeared to them because they're weirdly kind of funny or something of that sort. But she just kind of progressively irritated me. And then the part that, as you would expect in a fantasy romance to be something that you would want to enjoy, which would be the romance, once that started to take center stage, I think I was especially getting put off a little bit, because it felt a little bit like the love interest will be a doormat and you'll walk all over him as the protagonist because he just loves you so much. And there are reasons for that, but it was still exceptionally irritating. I think I would have enjoyed the story so much more if I enjoyed the main character so much more. And also, this is one of those stories that felt more like, if you've ever heard the terms a plotter or a pantser, this one, as far as how it played out, very much felt more like a pantser type of story, which, if you've never heard those, I'll describe them very briefly. A plotter is somebody who tends to, in their writing, plot things out far more in advance. It's a good way to foreshadow a lot more, but sometimes the drawback is that it can feel a little bit stilted, or like characters will do things outside of what they've had established for their character just to fit the plot. So there's pros and cons to both, not saying one's better, it's just a process. But with pantsers, you just kind of write as it comes to you. And that can create for suspense, and it can be a lot of twists and turns. But the foreshadowing can lack, and then you get to the end and you're like, what? That's such a bizarre ending. How does that fit with anything? Or it can feel unsatisfying. And this one felt like a pantser type of writing in that things would just start happening, and then the character, having never really clued you into any of this or even indicated that they knew anything about these things, would suddenly give you basically an info dump about whatever was right in front of them. And I almost think it would have worked better if the character was at a loss as to what was happening, instead of always knowing what was right in front of her as it would happen. I think that actually would have created more suspense. But it did result in the book feeling kind of meandering at the same time. And it is a pretty long book, so unfortunately, this one was also a bit of a miss. I mean, that's kind of the whole point of today's video. We've gone on long enough. It's time to mention Fourth Wing. I really tried with Fourth Wing. First off, Fourth Wing, when I bought it, I know you're not supposed to do this. I didn't know it was out too soon. But Fourth Wing was out before it was technically having its release date. I saw it on the shelf at the bookstore and I was like, what's this? And I read the synopsis and I was like, okay, I'll give this one a go. So I actually read it before it was officially released. Again, I wouldn't have done that if I had known that it was technically out early, because I know you're not supposed to do that. It messes with numbers. Although I will say, I don't think that mattered at all when it came to this story, because it ended up being wildly successful. But still, on principle, I know you're not supposed to. I just didn't know. Anyway, point is, I read this one before it was out, and thus I had nobody's thoughts in my head. I read this and I was like, oh, this is not my kind of writing at all. I'm not a fan of, you know, when people put the clapping emoji between their words? I don't care if you do that in a text or whatever, text how you want. I don't like when it feels like that's the cadence of sentences, which in this story, there's a lot of period, period, period in the story. It feels very much like how people talk in comment sections or how people text each other, which I understand there's a point to that sometimes in contemporary stories. You're trying to tap into what people actually sound like, what they talk like in modern day. And I'm not opposed to the idea of having a more modern way of talking within a fantasy world. Definitely can make things more accessible, but I still prefer a little bit more formality in my writing. Not that I need it all the time, not that you can't play around with style and tone. I think something like Gideon the Ninth has beautiful prose and then really stupid jokes, and the way that it mixes really works for me. The writing style was already not to my liking. I found that this story fits almost within that, the kind of reverse of what actually has been criticized in a lot of fantasy books, which is that when you have the main perspective is a man and the way they talk about the female characters in the story, you're kind of like, ugh. And I felt like that a little bit about Fourth Wing, where the way that the men are described, I don't love it, to be honest. I understand characters finding other characters attractive. I'm not saying that's wrong whatsoever, and I don't mind the other characters thinking about how much they find the other person attractive. But I found right away there was language that was a little bit leaning into almost the objectification of some of the male characters, and that's also not my cup of tea, because when it comes to the stories I'm reading, again, I absolutely understand attraction being a thing in stories, and sometimes attraction you can't even explain. You know, I understand all that, and I understand chemistry. But I also really resonate with stories that are showcasing an extreme amount of depth in what the characters have transformed their feelings from just attraction into something deeper. Or going even further to sometimes they don't even know if they feel attraction, and it is those deeper feelings that lead to the attraction. I think both of those can work really, really well. But I've already kind of stated that when it's lustiness first, and then eventually that kind of leads to love. And I personally don't always feel like there's as much in the relationship building to make that leap, then it ends up not as much working for me. So that's another part of it as well. Still really likes the dragons, and I didn't love the stakes in this. I thought they were a little nonsensical at times, but I was like, okay, I'll read the next one and let's see how things branch out. And a lot of what wasn't working for me in the first one continued in the second one. So while I think that it is extremely accessible and really fun, and the pacing is extraordinary, it moves really fast, and it combines a lot of what people love about fantasy, but in a kind of fresh and fun new way. While I think all of that is true, it's just not one that works for me. But that's it for some very, very well-loved fantasy romance books that are considered staples within the genre that just aren't quite to my tastes. And if you have found that you have similar tastes to me and you want to give some recommendations, feel free to do so. And if you're somebody who loves these books, just know, of course, that as always, books are very subjective. By no means am I saying that my feelings about these are objective truths about them. So if you want to talk about why you love these, then feel free to do so. And if you want to give a recommendation just in general that you think, hey, this book isn't as hyped, I wish more people would read it, feel free to do so. I hope you have a great rest of your day, though. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you later. Bye.